king was a great disappointment to Jon. His father had talked of him often, the peerless Robert Baratheon, demon of the Trident, the fiercest warrior of the realm, a giant among princes. Jon only saw a fat man, red-faced under his beard, sweating through his silks, walking like a man half in his cups. The Thoughts of Jon Snow, a Game of Thrones Chapter 5, Jon 1. Robert Baratheon is many things to many people. The man who stood up to the tyranny that was House Targaryen under the Mad King. To others, a usurper who stole the throne from the rightful claimant and allowed the murder of innocent children in his name. And in some degree, both of these cases could be framed as correct. But there is one thing that men who fought on both sides of Robert's rebellion tend to agree on, that Robert Baratheon was a fierce warrior, and not a man you would wish to face on the battlefield. Not only was he described as a good fighter, but a commander as well, a man who men respected, who treated both his allies and his foes with respect and fairness, with a booming voice that could be heard, shouting commands over the sound of steel on steel. Unlike a lot of the lords around him, Robert had the vigour and fearlessness of youth on his side. He was a huge bull of a man who towered over the battlefield, possessing a natural strength of several men. But it's clear that Robert also had qualities that negatively impacted his ability as a warrior, being consumed by rage and bloodlust in battle, and thus allowing him to make reckless decisions that would put himself and others in danger. The question I want to ask with this video is, was Robert Baratheon truly a great fighter that the histories make him out to be? Or was his ability less down to skill and more to his sheer confidence in himself that made him such a hard man to fight? They said Robert Baratheon was strong as a bull and fearless in battle, a man who loved nothing better than war. The Thoughts of Daenerys Targaryen, A Clash of Kings Chapter 27, Daenerys 2. From what we can gather, for what is considered normal for young lords of Westeros, is that as a child, Robert would have likely been trained by a master-at-arms of Storm's End, likely in swordplay, given it was the most commonly used weapon among lords and knights. He would likely have trained alongside his brother Stannis, as well as other boys his own age. It would have been during this initial training that Robert would have likely been drawn to the idea of the Warhammer that he became famous for, likely guided there by his master-at-arms. Learning how to wield a sword properly takes skill and patience, which as we know is not a strong part of Robert's character, whereas a warhammer, while still a devastating weapon, takes far less practical skill to use effectively. Once he was fostered at the Eyrie by Jon Arryn as a teenager, it's very likely Robert and Eddard Stark trained together. The trouble is with training is it can never really replicate the true nature of combat, and you're only really ever as good as the people you train with. Both Eddard Stark and Stannis Baratheon have shown themselves to be competent fighters, not say reaching the heights of the likes of Barris and Selmy or Arthur Dayne, but can hold their own well enough. In terms of swordplay, it's implied by the fact that Robert was using a hammer, he may not have had the skill to beat a man one-on-one with a blade, at least in his youth, as there's evidence that as an adult he did wield a sword as well as his hammer. Because a hammer is fundamentally different from a sword and uses very different elements of your skill set. So while a warhammer is not as much of a skilled weapon as a blade, all that matters in a fight is how you use the tools at your disposal. Does it really matter that much if Robert wasn't as skillful with a blade, when his power with a hammer more than made up for it? Does that really impact if he deserves to be held up as a good example of a warrior? This Baratheon is fearless. He fights the way a king should. Godric Borrell. On Robert at the Battle of Gulltown, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 9, Davos 1. I think the best way to look at Robert Baratheon's skill as a warrior, and to help us understand why maybe he gained his reputation, is to take a look at the battles he fought in. Surprisingly, we know very little about his first real battle, but unsurprisingly it did come during Robert's rebellion, when the rebels had to attack and take Gulltown, so Jon Arryn, who was in command at this point, could secure the Vale, given House Grafton had declared in favour of the Loyalists. Robert was the first over the walls and into the thick of battle, and men said he was fearless. He also, unsurprisingly, killed his first man during this battle. While this was likely some random Grafton soldier on the battlements, the truth is, we don't really know. In the same battle, Robert did kill Lord Mark Grafton, the Lord of Gulltown, in single combat. What this battle shows is one of the better qualities in Robert as a fighter, his fearlessness. Being the first to attack a besieged city wall is not a task most men would actively seek out, but it is an early case of Robert leading his men from the front, a quality that many on both sides of the war would commendate. One thing that's often overlooked here is that maybe at this stage it's not the intent of Jon Arryn to crown Robert king, as the end goal of the rebellion was far from clear. As it seems to me very unlikely Jon Arryn would have allowed Robert to be the first over the wall if he at this time intended for him to become king at the end of the war, which to me suggests the idea came later in the war than many expect. I suspect around the time of the marriage of Eddard and Jon Arryn to Catelyn and Lysa Tully. But the point here is Robert proved himself a fearless warrior and gained a lot of respect for it. We all know what my brother would do. Robert would gallop to the gates of Winterfell alone, break them down with his warhammer, and ride through the rubble to slay Roose Bolton with his left hand, and the bastard with his right. I'm not Robert, but we will march, and we will free Winterfell, or die in the attempt. Stannis Baratheon to Richard Horpe, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 42, The King's Prize. The next battle he fought in was technically 3 battles in a single day, and the first he personally had command over. When Robert managed to return to Storm's End, he was faced with some of his lords declaring for House Targaryen. When Robert learned that Lords Grandison, Catherine, and Fell planned to gather their hosts at Summerhall in order to march on Storm's End, he rode ahead with his mounted knights and fought each of the lords in turn, defeating all 3 before they had time to rally into a single army. Robert would then return to Storm's End with his captives, and won the loyalty of Lords Catherine and Grandison, as well as Silveraxe Fell, the son of Lord Fell, who Robert had slain during the battle. Now we know very little about the Battle of Summerhall itself, but we do know that Robert did defeat Lord Fell in single combat. While we have no idea how good of a fighter Lord Fell was, beating any lord, especially an older, more experienced lord, is not an easy feat. But more so, what the Battle of Summerhall shows us that Gulltown didn't, is Robert Baratheon was smart enough and competent enough of a commander to spot the danger of Grandison, Catherine and Fell merging their armies, and he took the initiative and battled them separately, a genius military move, and one deserving of the high praise it gets. But again, in the aftermath of the battle, he forgave many of those who fought against him. Some may call this weakness, but I think there's just as much of a case to be made that showing a defeated foe mercy when you hold their life in your hands can bind them more loyally to you than a simple oath from decades ago. Because at the end of the day, words are wind. Robert's charisma made him the kind of leader men wanted to follow, something important for a warrior. The following Battle of Ashford was Robert Baratheon's first loss. His men were set upon by the vanguard of House Tyrell, led by Randyll Tarly, as he attempted to head north to reach the Riverlands, where they could link up with the allied rebel forces. Tarly won the battle so soundly, Robert was forced to run from the battlefield and force march his remaining men north, effectively abandoning the Stormlands to House Tyrell in the hopes they could reach the other rebels, rallying in the Riverlands. Given what we know about Robert's character, taking a loss like this would have been hard and damaged his ego badly. But the important thing to recall is despite the loss, Robert and some of his men did live. If they had not retreated, they would likely have been killed or had been captured at Ashford, with that dramatically changing the face of the rebellion. So while I expect Robert withdrew reluctantly, he did the sensible thing and saved his men and himself to fight another day. The next battle, the Battle of the Bells, is the first time we get to see a true picture of what Robert Baratheon was like in combat. I wanted the glory of slaying Robert in single combat, and I did not want the name of Butcher, so Robert escaped me and cut down Rhaegar on the Trident. The Thoughts of Jon Connington, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 61, The Griffin Reborn. The Battle of the Bells stands out among the battles of the rebellion, given much of it was a game of cat and mouse, as loyalist forces led by the Hand of the King, Jon Connington, had tracked Robert Baratheon and his retinue within the town of Stony Sept, conducting door-to-door searches of the town to try and locate him. Robert was in fact hid in a brothel, and when the rebels attacked the city, he emerged from his hiding place with a sword in hand. And this is what makes the Battle of the Bells different. For whatever reason, Robert did not have access to his famed warhammer and had to make do with a sword, By all accounts, he was just as effective with a blade as he was with a warhammer, which might put a wrinkle in the idea he didn't have the skill to effectively wield the sword, which is why he thus chose the warhammer. Harwin, who was the master at arms at Winterfell, tells Arya Stark that Robert Baratheon killed 6 men, as well as Sir Miles Mouton, a well-regarded and famous knight, who was also the squire to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. So it would seem that Robert was still an effective warrior with a blade, even managing to kill a famed knight, which would not have been an easy task for even an average fighter. We also have an account of the same battle by Lord John Connington, who was handed the king and commanding the Loyalist forces. Connington claims to have faced Robert, with Robert almost killing him on the steps of the old sept that gave the town its name. John Connington was again another well-regarded warrior, with at least comparable training you'd expect any lord in Westeros to have. So what the Battle of the Bells shows us is that even if a sword was not the preferred weapon of Robert, it doesn't mean he couldn't wield one. Yes, he may not have been able to beat a more skillful warrior in this manner, preferring a warhammer, which leans into his strengths better, but it doesn't mean he didn't have at least a decent ability with a blade, which again, when you combine with his other assets, such as size and strength, makes him a hard man to beat, even if he's not necessarily using the blade skillfully. They had come together at the ford of the Trident, where the battle crashed around them, Robert with his warhammer and great antlered helm, the Targaryen prince armoured, all in black. On his breastplate was a 3-headed dragon of his house, wrought all in rubies that flashed like fire in the sunlight. The waters of the Trident ran red around the hooves of the Desseres as they circled and clashed, again and again, till the last crushing blow from Robert's hammer dove in the dragon and the chest beneath it. When Ned had finally come to the scene, Rhaegar lay dead in the stream, while men of both armies scrambled in the swelling waters for rubies knocked free from his armour. The thoughts of Eddard Stark, The Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard 1. The final battle of the rebellion Robert took part in was of course the Trident, with his role in that maybe being his most documented battle, given the sheer impact of his actions on the history of Westeros. It is noted that Robert seemed to have had the command during the battle, with multiple characters who were present on both sides recalling his booming voice giving commands. Something I think is clear during the Trident that isn't present in the other battles of the rebellion is it really shows how this is now Robert's rebellion, with Robert himself at the centre of the rebel cause. It is now much more than fighting the tyranny of the Mad King, trying to recover Lyanna Stark and revenge for the deaths of Brandon and Rickard Stark. It's now equally about Robert's claim to the throne and the reputation he has built himself over the course of the war. We know it all came to a head when Prince Rhaegar faced off with Robert in single combat in the middle of the Ruby Ford. Both men a horse charged the other, Robert with his warhammer, Prince Rhaegar a sword, meeting in the rushing water with Robert besting Rhaegar when he caved in Rhaegar's chest with his warhammer, sending the ornate ruby decoration flying into the river. It seems that Robert didn't just beat Rhaegar, but he did so decisively. Now, there are a few factors at play when it comes to this single combat between Robert and Rhaegar that do need to be pointed out. Namely, this is the first person that Robert has fought where we have some clear idea of their skill level. While Rhaegar wasn't the kind of famed swordsman as the likes of Arthur Dayne, Barristan Selmy or Jaime Lannister, by all accounts he was a skilled swordsman, better than your average lord or knight. While he took little interest in martial pursuits at a young age, as he got older he did seem to take his training much more seriously, being knighted at 17 and distinguishing himself in countless tourneys. I think there's an argument that can be put forward that Rhaegar was the most technically gifted fighter Robert faced, and yet, still thanks to his raw strength, he managed to beat him. But there is often other overlooked factors at play when it comes to the duel between Robert and Rhaegar that has nothing to do with skill and training. Because the thing with battles is, there is only so much training can offer you. The Battle of the Trident was Rhaegar's first real battle. Not only that, it's very possible that his duel with Robert was his first proper experience in combat outside of the training yard or tourney grounds. Not only was this huge, bloody, decisive battle his first real taste of bloodshed, he was fighting a man who at this point had not only proven himself to be a good fighter, had a personal vendetta against Rhaegar for the kidnap of Lyanna Stark. Robert was known to be reckless and ruthless in a normal battle, but, as all accounts of the Trident tell us, Robert fought with something that cannot be trained for, a sense of purpose and blind, unstoppable rage. What Rhaegar came up against that day was an immovable wall, and that's not the kind of fight you want for your first real combat. If Rhaegar had the combat experience of Robert, I think maybe the Trident could have gone differently, but it really may have been the difference maker that day, and with it, Robert's reputation as a warrior was cemented. Robert should have scoured the Isles after Balon Greyjoy rose against him. He smashed their fleet, burned their towns, and broke their castles. But when he had them on their knees, he let them up again. He should have made another island of their skulls. The Thoughts of Cersei Lannister. A Feast of Crows, Chapter 32, Cersei 7. The last battle we know Robert played a role in is during the Greyjoy Rebellions. It is likely he took some part in some smaller battles, such as the Battle of Lordsport, where he is said to have burnt down the castle of House Botley. But other than that, we don't really hear much about him fighting, because at the end of the day, he is now king, and it's reasonable to assume his advisors, such as say Jon Arryn, wouldn't want him putting himself in too much danger with this new dynasty at risk as a result. We can't really know for sure, but one thing I will say is that given what we know about the character of Robert, it would seem strange if he didn't take an active part in the conflict. He was always a man to lead from the front, and even during the main books, despite his poor physical fitness, he still wants to take part in the Hand's tourney, having to be talked down by Eddard, who correctly points out that he is the king. They cannot risk him being hurt, and no man would have risked hurting him. Now, in terms of the Siege of Pike itself, we know surprisingly very little about what actually happened, other than a few key details. We know that Robert was not the first through the breach like he had been in his youth, but he was one of the first few to enter alongside Eddard Stark and Jorah Mormont, and as expected, he did wield his Warhammer. Given the outcome of the Siege of Pike and how decisively Robert won, it's likely he did see combat, but nothing too significant that it was worth noting or any recognition, the same way Thoros Amir being the first through the breach with his flaming sword is. So from looking at every battle that Robert fought, we can surmise a few key things. He was a good commander who liked to lead from the front, the kind of leader his men respected, being able to command loyalty both of his own bannermen and his foes as well. While he could use a sword, his preferred weapon was a warhammer, which played into his strengths better, namely his sheer size and his unnatural physical strength. But he also possessed a reckless streak, especially when the conflict was more personal. While this would fill him with a rage that would allow him to fight with ferocity, in this bloodlust, he would often put himself in dangerous situations. And while this made him hard to fight against, and very intimidating, it can often limit your view of the bigger picture of the battle and your surroundings. Most of the men who Robert fought were, by and large, at least equal in skill level as him, with maybe Rhaegar Targaryen standing out as being more technically gifted as a fighter. But in the circumstances of the Battle of the Trident, the mix of Robert's fury and Rhaegar's perhaps inexperience of real combat was enough to level the playing field, and maybe could have pushed it in Robert's favour that day. Something also to consider is even outside of the battlefield, Robert had proven himself a capable warrior. He had fought many tourneys from a young age, and would even win the melee at the Tourney of Harrenhal, the largest tourney for a generation with hundreds of knights competing. And while we have established that the tourney doesn't replicate a battlefield, it did help the young Robert hone his skills and learn the positives and drawbacks of his fighting style, as well as filling him with a sense of self-assurance and confidence, which may have factored into why he was able to make the transition from tourney ground to real battle so seamlessly. The choice of using a warhammer over a sword is also a factor that should not be downplayed. As the Battle of the Bells shows us, Robert was at least a competent fighter with a blade, killing 6 men, including Miles Mooton, and almost killing Jon Connington. That's not an easy thing to do, especially it seems as Jon Connington is quite a highly regarded fighter. So while he wasn't as naturally gifted as the likes of Arthur Dayne, it seems he could still best most average fighters. So while the choice of a warhammer might make it seem that Robert was not a good swordsman, the evidence says otherwise. His choice of a warhammer is really Robert playing into his own physical strengths. But not only that, when a majority of others you will be facing will be using a sword or a shield, the use of a weapon such as a warhammer will really catch your opponents off guard if they're not ready for it. A warhammer works really differently from a sword. It relies on sheer strength of the wielder, with its main point of damage being crushing, and force, leaving an opponent with broken bones and internal injuries. Warhammers are also much more effective against foes in full plate armour, which is often the case with the kinds of men Robert would have been fighting in single combat. And as the fate of Rhaegar Targaryen shows us, if a Warhammer connects, its damage can be devastating. But like all weapons, Warhammers do have their downsides. Namely, if you can get up close to someone with a Warhammer, you can prevent them from swinging the hammer back enough to get enough force to really do damage. Warhammers, like Robert's, have a much longer effective range than you might think. It's the same reason someone with a short sword or daggers might have an advantage over someone with long swords if they can get in close enough and pass the effective range of the longsword. Yet it's not easy, but if you can do it, you can have the upper hand. The lighter, shorter weapons can outmaneuver the longsword. Robert's choice not only plays into his strengths, but I think it's a tactical one as well. He knows most of the common men in an army will be poorly equipped, and when it comes to the knights he will be facing in single combat, probability is they'll be using a full plate, wielding some kind of bladed weapon. Therefore, the use of a warhammer will give him a slight advantage. Also consider, a lot of people may not be used to fighting against a warhammer, and their unfamiliarity with the weapon will also favour Robert. I think a really good example to show just how much a weapon choice can impact a fight is to look at Sir Cristion Cole, who was a member of the Kingsguard for King Viserys I Targaryen, before eventually becoming Lord Commander, and then handed the king to King Aegon II during the Dance of the Dragons. Cole is said to be one of the best fighters of his generation, and while it's hard to say if he was as good as, say, Arthur Dayne or Barristan Selmy, we know that at least among his peers of the time, he was regarded as one of the best. Daemon Targaryen was also seen as one of the best fighters of his generation, and a skilled swordsman from a young age, thus why he was given the Valyrian steel blade Dark Sister. When Daemon and Criston faced each other in a tourney in 104 AC to celebrate the ascension of King Viserys to the throne, Cole was by far not as well known as he would become, with many assuming Daemon would win the tourney. But Cole beat Daemon in single combat, even knocking Darksister from his hand to the absolute shock of all in attendance. This is no easy task, but something that I think helped Criston a lot was his choice of weapons. Not the normal sword, but a Morning Star, a weapon Daemon was unfamiliar with facing, and a factor that may have given him an edge over the skillful Daemon. So the weapon you choose can really have a huge impact. Being a good fighter in a lot of medieval-based fantasy fiction often gets misconstrued with being a good swordsman, when in fact there are so many other factors at play that impact if someone is a good warrior and a good fighter. Their personality, their experience, their training, their choice of weapons and armour, and there are some things just can't be accounted for, such as purpose and motivation. Would Robert Baratheon have fought so ruthlessly and savagely during the rebellion if he had not been so personally invested in it due to the kidnap of Lyanna Stark? All of these things matter and have an impact. Look at Prince Rhaegar. Yes, he was an excellent swordsman, but that alone wasn't enough to win the day, and there were elements to his ability as a fighter he lacked that Robert possessed. To put it in D&D terms, I would see Robert Baratheon as not your standard fighter, but more of a barbarian who leans into his pure strength more. His reckless and battle rage also fits with the barbarian's frenzying. I also think him multiclassing into champion fighter might make sense as well, but the point is, Robert's not your average fighter. Robert Baratheon was no Arthur Dayne, Barristan Selmy, or Jaime Lannister. He played his own game and played into his own strengths that make him stand out against these legendary swordsmen. While Robert was not a conventionally good warrior, he was still a good one, thanks to him embracing the elements of combat he was good at. I think this quote from Jon Snow remembering what Ned Stark had told him about Robert when the king's retinue arrives at Winterfell really speaks volumes of the kind of warrior Robert was. His father talked of him often. Peerless Robert, demon of the Trident, the fiercest warrior of the realm, a giant among princes.